All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Leonie Joubert. I'm a science writer based in Cape Town, specialized largely in writing about climate change, and very recently have become interested in the mental health implications of climate change. Thank you for joining us. So the term eco-anxiety, it's getting bandied about a lot lately. And it's not just some fad state of mind for people who've got too much time to navel gaze. Oxford Dictionaries actually shortlisted the term in 2019. That was the year that the climate truth bomb hit, when the United Nations, one of its more recent publications, showed us how serious the situation actually is. And what's curious is we're starting to see an emergence worldwide of psychologists and psychiatrists and people in the mental health space acknowledging the mental health implications of climate collapse. And I guess it expresses itself in two ways. There's the emotional response to surviving an extreme weather event, such as losing your home to a fire or a flood, the stress of having to migrate, the stress of not knowing how you will feed your kids in the next few months. Those acute events can cause traumatic responses. And then, of course, there is the chronic stress, the chronic anxiety of living the rest of our lives in the context where society and the world we live in is becoming increasingly unstable because the climate is no longer what our species evolved to live in. So the next IPCC report from the United Nations, the sixth assessment report, which will come out next year, the health chapter in that assessment report is going to give unprecedented space to the mental health implications. And we're talking depression, anxiety, self-medication of that using substances in a way that is unhealthy, increased violence, and possibly even self-harm and suicide. These are some of the ways that surviving extreme weather events or this kind of chronic existential stress can manifest itself in our behaviors. So how do we as a society and as communities rally around one another in order to support from a mental health perspective? That's one of the emerging areas, and it's particularly important for our youth. For those of us who are in the second half of our lives, it's terrifying to face this future. For someone who's at the start of their life, how much more so? And what support do we have in place? So I'm delighted that we are having this conversation today. Our panelists today, we have Sarah Birch. She is the Climate Change Adaptation Lead for the Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning with the Western Cape Government. And she's a mental health coach. She works extensively in this area to support around climate-related anxiety. Gabriel Klaasen is the youth leader with the African Climate Alliance, based here in Cape Town. Looking forward, Gabriel, to your contribution around what the youth need and what the youth are really grappling with already. Ann Cullinan, known to most of us as Max, is a clinical psychologist practicing in the southern suburbs and specializes in trauma. But more than that, Max has been engaged very meaningfully with this question of how we cope with climate stress, and has worked extensively behind to processes, acknowledging that the head knowledge we're going to share today is useful, but actually it's the therapeutic practice of learning how to sit with this discomfort. That's where our healing and resilience is going to come from. So I'm looking forward, Max, to hearing your contribution there. And then we have Gareth Morgan. He's with the City of Cape Town Resilience Unit, the acting executive director of corporate services and the director of resilience. This session is hosted for us by the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership. I'm not going to go into too much detail around what this relationship is and what the function is. Marcelo can pop that into the chat window. But the idea is to coordinate processes where different stakeholders engage with what the main challenges are that we face in the future, and then look at practical solutions to addressing those. And that's what today is going to be about. How do we pull together as a city, as a community, as families, to support one another through what is an increasingly scary looking future. So we're going to hand over to Gareth quickly to just give us a quick provocation. And then after that, panelists, I'm going to ask each of you to just give a 5-minute sort of overview of what is front and center for you in this regard. Gareth, handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Leonie, and good morning to everyone. Thank you to our panelists for being with us today and sharing, and they will share their insights, learnings and ideas going forward around this critical challenge of the mental health impacts of climate change. Also, good day to our colleagues at the EDP and to all people who are joining us today from wherever they are in the Western Cape and the world. Just a note about Futurecasting events. This event is the 4th Futurecasting event of 2021. Futurecasting is an action of the Resilience Strategy, one of the 75 actions in the strategy that seeks to bring together a range of stakeholders in order to grapple with a challenging topic that is emerging and is likely to be a feature of our future, even if we don't desire it to be so, and commonly brings together a range of representatives from different sectors. As I said, this is with the 4th of this year, and we endeavour to, around different topics, working with the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership to have a number of these next year as well. Mental health and resilience in general is an action of the Cape Town Resilience Strategy at the moment. While not focused particularly on climate change during as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, a campaign was run earlier this year, principally around March, but also refeatured in October this year, called the How Are You campaign. Recognizing the limitation on resources for mental health, particularly from a municipal governance, for which the function of health is primarily a provincial function, there was a need to run a campaign around the impacts and the compounding traumas of COVID, which obviously lands in our population with many other traumas as well. And climate change and its impacts inevitably land as well on layered trauma in our society. So the How Are You campaign was a virtual campaign, obviously attempting to drive Cape Townians towards particular resources that could assist in a resource-constrained environment. It was based on similar campaigns that have been run in other parts of the world, notably in Australia. I look forward to the discussion today. Thank you once again to the participants. This discussion obviously is timely, considering the events going on in Glasgow at the moment, and I'm glad that we're able to focus on a topic that certainly to date has not received much attention, although I know all the panelists here are talking and driving and coordinating on these issues, but generally it's not a topic in amongst the broad range of climate topics that is giving sufficient attention. I'm glad we're able to contribute in some way to that today. Leonie, thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Gareth. And yes, this reminds me again that there is still so much stigma associated with mental health. If I had a chronic heart condition or had insulin-dependent diabetes and had to get through a crisis of a heat wave, the medical community in the world would accept that I just have an ordinary, biological issue with my body that makes me more at risk with in a heat wave. But if I were to step forward and say I've got a chronic anxiety issue and surviving this stress is a life-threatening situation for me, society views that very differently. So I think, Gareth, your closing point is really important, that we need to normalize this conversation. And lots of research to show that during a heat wave, one's anger levels go up, resilience goes down, there's a higher chance of violence, of self-harm, etc., etc. And these are really important things to consider and think about. So I'm going to ask Sarah if you could just briefly tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks, Leonie. Good morning, everyone. So as Leonie introduced me at the beginning, I come to this discussion with two hats. So I'll weave those together in my response. But yeah, it's a big topic, and there's a lot to say, and there's a lot on my mind. But I think to start with, so from my Western Cape government perspective, I'm involved in our provincial adaptation response. So that's looking at a whole range of aspects, but health is part of that picture. And mental health, we're trying to start bringing into the picture to see, well, what can we do? What needs to be done? And it's really early days. And we've been looking to other parts of the world to see what's going on, what is being done. And we are seeing that climate change is really kind of unraveling this mental health crisis on top of many other existing mental health crises. We see that in other parts of the world where they've done the research that 70 to 80% of young folk are experiencing forms of eco-anxiety, climate grief, and these different kind of terms are coming up, but they're all kind of talking to the same thing. So it's really becoming prevalent, and we have the sense that it is happening in South Africa as well, when we really need to get to grips with what we are facing and figuring out how to provide that support. And I liked some of the intro sort of things that were touched on, just around how do we get community to support each other, and how do we like rally around each other to support each other. This is really important. So the Western Cape government has actually just released the Western Cape Climate Change Response Strategy 2050, Vision 2050, and that was released this week. And so I'm just plugging that here to mention that we would love inputs into that, especially from the health sector, the mental health sector. How can we bolster that? We'd love to welcome dialogue around this. So mental health is part of that, but it's really, it's still very new. And you know, myself as a practitioner on climate change and just, you know, a human on this planet, I've been really grappling with this myself. So how do I deal with my own eco-anxiety, my own grief for what is happening around us in the world? And that also brought me to seek, you know, support, to seek answers. And I've come across, you know, there is some work that's being done, some support groups, some ways of actually creating support around each other, that's kind of peer-to-peer support, some methodologies of working through our personal journeys in terms of eco-anxiety and climate grief. But in South Africa, it's really in its nascent stages. So we need to figure out ways that are also appropriate to South African context, to our cultures, to our context. They're very different to, you know, in North America or Europe or Australia, for example, where some of this work is emerging from. So I am really hopeful that this work really takes off in South Africa, that we can actually create this network of support for others. And I think just my closing point here for now is, it's really important that we see eco-anxiety, climate grief, ecological grief as it's not a pathology. It's not a kind of a disordered way of looking at our mental health, but it's really an appropriate response to what is happening in the world around us. It's an appropriate response to our environment changing rapidly, so rapidly that we've never experienced this kind of change, I think, as a collective species on this planet. So it's important to recognize that, and to recognize that we need to be actually embracing ways to feel our emotions around what is happening, and not to push them away, because when we do that, we start creating this dissonance, and we start kind of putting it away in a little box, which doesn't help us to confront and actually rise to collective positive action. So that's my closing point there, Leonie. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. And I really think this is going to be one of the most important take-home messages from today, is that all of us content experts like myself, we can pull together all of the information we want, and there's no shortage of platforms to publish it on. But what we really are going to need as a community is the practitioners who are able to facilitate these processes with individuals and groups that help people to sit with this discomfort. I think that is the critical skill that we're going to need from the psychiatric and the psychology community. Gabriel.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. In essence, I just want to echo a few points that I'm going to probably touch a bit more deeply into later. But a massive aspect of my work as a young person, so I'm the youth coordinator, not youth leader, because I don't believe that youth have a leader. We kind of work together. And as someone who lives in a marginalized community on the Cape Flats and has lived in the Cape Flats my entire life, who also suffers with mental health issues to a massive extent, a lot of what is being said right now and what I anticipate to be said later on, it resonates with me, and I'm glad that things are happening, but at the same time, we don't necessarily see it in my community. As a young person and a colored person from the Cape Flats who grew up in a community where culture is one thing as well as stigma, so deeply woven throughout our community and the older generations, with unaddressed trauma, post-94 and pre-94, I think what we really see is that there's a lot to be done and a lot needs to be done. A lot of unlearning and relearning within our communities, but more so, I'll speak specifically toward youth. There was a mention that Sarah just mentioned now about peer-to-peer learning or peer-to-peer support, which is quite a gorgeous thing, but young people are already doing that. And I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, because it's a good thing that we have these safe spaces that we try to create with one another. But at the end of the day, we aren't professionals. We are just friends talking about things together to a point where it's like, cool, I'm suffering. And then the next person's like, oh, I'm suffering too. Okay, cool, we're suffering together. And there's not necessarily a way forward. It's just kind of dampening it until it flares up again. And what I mean by that is the lulls, because I don't think people have just a bad or a good mental health. I think it's an ebb and a flow, so to speak. And people need to learn to recognize that. And so when it comes to climate change and the impacts that climate change has on young people specifically, I was a part of a panel with Dr. Garrett Barnwell a few months ago, and we discussed the trauma that young people will face and are facing in marginalized communities. I don't like the word marginalized, but I'll use it for the audience today. Otherwise, I normally use underrepresented and under-resourced. I definitely think that we need to address the fact that, without looking at everything, if we don't look at everything interconnectedly, we miss out on the opportunities to ensure that we have a future where people's not only their physical, but their emotional and mental support is taken care of and fostered. I'll talk a bit more into that as well as the way that we come out of pandemics continuously, but the running pandemic being climate change is never addressed, as well as the mental support that comes out of that, as well as the disproportionate support that is provided in our country, and that we've also seen with other most affected areas and people around the world. So I definitely look forward to this panel today, and I look forward to kind of learning myself, as well as having a bit of back and forth in jest, of course. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Max, can I hand over to you now?
Max, you're on mute. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks, Leonie. I think I wanted to just say that
like Sarah, I kind of came to this work very much through my own eco-anxiety, or to put, more realistically to say, it was only when I got in touch with it that I realized the extent to which I had been suppressing it and not dealing with it. And I think that from my perspective, where I feel that eco-psychology can create a bridge between the kind of individual pain and suffering that obviously comes up in our therapy rooms and the wider community, is to take some of the ideas which have been around for a long time in psychology and not completely transpose them onto potential work that we can do with communities, but and with individuals as well, but to take what's useful from it in terms of looking at what happens to us when we're experiencing extreme emotional or mental or somatic distress, and we're not finding a way to express any of that or work through it, in psychological language, to process it. So I think that, it's largely a response to the fact that, eco-anxiety has been around actually for quite a while, but it's really gained a lot of traction, I would say, over the last, well, certainly since the IPCC report, but over the last 30 years. Individual psychologists and researchers and writers have done some really interesting and important work around it. And again, just to kind of pick up on what Gabriel was saying, this latest report that was, I think, put forward by Avaz, that came out of Imperial College London, where they interviewed 10,000 young people over 10 countries. We know that there's a disproportionate amount of anxiety that is occurring amongst young people. And partly that's because they're not in charge. They are the most vulnerable because they don't have the means to make the kind of huge political, economic, and other changes that need to be made. And yet, they're the ones who are feeling these, all the usual things that people feel with eco-anxiety, some of which have been mentioned by Leonie as well. Helplessness, despair, fear, anger, numbness. But on top of that, what is coming out really clearly is the youth are feeling a huge amount of betrayal and abandonment by governments and by adults. And on top of that, a sense of moral injury. And by moral injury, for those who aren't familiar with the term, it is a sense that somehow you've been made complicit in something deeply unpleasant happening, which you didn't want to be a part of, and yet you are a part of it. And there isn't much you can do to undo that. But I think that where that leaves us is once we get to that point of acceptance, and this has been likened sometimes, the whole eco-anxiety thing has been likened to the 5 stages of grief. So, we've had anger where we take to the streets. We've had denial where, people are saying this is not happening, we've had bargaining, we've got 10 years, we've got 9 years. Maybe we can solve this with technology. We've got depression, which I think many of us here feel is the most accessible of all of those stages, and anxiety as well. And then there's acceptance. But with the acceptance, that's about not falling into paralysis or numbness. And this is where I do think that the tools of psychology can be brought to bear so that people don't fall into panic on the one end of the spectrum or paralysis on the other, but that providing a forum in which people can not only speak out their emotions, but also be supported and be witnessed by others and not feel that it's hugely inappropriate to be feeling these feelings. I think for a lot of people, they haven't spoken about their eco-anxiety because it sort of feels inappropriate in some way. And I think that is fast changing. And, the youth have really sounded the alarm call on this. And it's opened up a huge path for people to be much more open about eco-anxiety. And then just also to wrap up, to say, you know, psychology, there's no diagnosis for eco-anxiety. And it is seen as actually an inevitable response, and even a healthy response to what's happening. And one person has actually described it as a very overdue outbreak of sanity. So I think that I'd like to sort of leave it there, which is, if you're feeling anxious, that is the same response, but don't let it paralyze you, and don't go into panic either.
And I have to say, thank you, Max. I have to say I've been extremely fortunate, you know, over the last 2 years to be able to walk side by side with Max through our own personal wrestling with this. What I kind of see it almost as a recovery curve, where you have this sense of denial, then you have this sort of catastrophic awakening where you realize how bad things are, then you potentially have collapse, which can be life-threatening, and then you come out of that collapse, if you're lucky, into a recovery curve where you're able to find a meaning and find resilience again. And I think you know, so many people working in the end of life sort of palliative space say that there are comparisons between where we are living now as a species, where it feels as though we've just been given a terminal diagnosis, and what happens for an individual, for instance, when they get a serious cancer diagnosis.
Yeah.
Something very low process, and these are conversations that are happening behind the scenes, I'm delighted to say. And picking up briefly on what Gabriel was saying, I'm reminded of a figure that came out a while ago. Apparently in South Africa, our public mental health gap is such that 3 out of 4 people who need emotional or psychiatric support are not able to get it from the state. So that would be, you know, talk therapy, counseling, or psychiatric medication. So what sort of models are available to us where we can get lay people to learn the basic skills that can step in, and something that we can learn quickly and easily, so that all of us can assist each other in a way that is ethical and responsible, and you know, where people aren't left unsupported because they don't have access to the private mental health space, which, you know, it costs something like 1,000 Rand an hour for a therapy session, and to see a psychiatrist for an hour will cost you 2,500 Rand. That's a lot of money. Okay, so Sarah, let's come back to you. First, with the reality of climate change, from your perspective, how can we best communicate a message of hope to different sectors of society? This does seem to be one of the important sort of take-home messages from climate communication. You want to hit people with the reality of facts. Let's not go into denial, but at the same time, we don't want them to slip into paralysis. So what is your suggestion and recommendation?
Great question, Leonie. Thanks. Sorry, I've got a bit of cold, so I'm a bit croaky. But yeah, so I think it's really important that there kind of is that dual message, like you just alluded to. So really helping people in different sectors, different communities to understand the reality of what lies ahead of us in terms of climate change. And that is still missing in a lot of places, a lot of sectors. We still don't actually have this understanding of the fact that we are in an emergency state. So it's really important that we have that on the table. It's an emergency. We are in the last available time period, essentially, where we can properly and kind of comprehensively tackle climate change, so that it is not an existential crisis for the whole planet. And that window of time is coming to an end in the next decade. So that's in terms of us really drawing down our emissions. But simultaneously, we're adapting to climate change, and we need to see that as something that we're going to be doing, even if we do meet our targets in the best possible way. And I do have hope, even while COP26 is still going on, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of angst about where that process is going. I do have hope that we will crack it collectively as as a civilization. It's really about how and how quickly that's going to happen. So it's firstly this understanding that we're going to be living in a period of change. So there's going to be change happening around us all the time for the next 100 years. And as humans, we need to start accepting that. So we've all been through like a trial by fire period of time with the COVID pandemic in the last year and a half. So tapping into that and understanding that that maybe is a little window into the future might not sound great. It might sound like not a very positive message, but I think that we can see that we can pull through these kinds of events and that we can reorganize ourselves, that we can create mechanisms to support each other. So I think it's very important that with this kind of reality check, we have this message of hope as well. There is hope, and hope is a strategy. It's not actually an optional. It's a resilience strategy that I believe that we have to embrace. It doesn't mean we're hopeful for a world that we had, 50 years ago, but we're hopeful for reimagining the world in different ways, so that we can kind of reorganize ourselves and have communities that are still caring and safe, and that we look after each other, even with disaster events happening. And I think that that's a really important message, that it's really about reimagining our world and how we work together and how we can be collaborative. And I think a lot of the soft skills of the world are absolutely fundamentally critical moving into the future. We need folks who are able to create this kind of community, to reconnect people to each other, to reconnect people to the land, to their local ecosystems, to really have like a regenerative kinds of mindsets. So we need to change our mindsets as much as we need to adapt our technologies and our infrastructure and all of that. So it's really about hearts and minds. And I think that if we can have a kind of movement working on that front, that then there's a lot of hope as well for the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. And just a reminder that this session will be going on until 11:30. We would love to engage with you all and have a nice conversation going. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please just pop them into the chat window, and towards the end of the session, we will come to those. I'm reminded also of the work of Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz and wrote that seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning, and after World War II. And what he found was that the individuals who were most likely to survive the horror of this concentration camp were individuals who were able to find meaning within all of it. And it has struck me so much. For me, the last 2 years have been exceedingly difficult. And I constantly find that the life buoy that I hold on to is finding, mindfully seeking out meaning within the knowledge that the next 10 or 15 years of my working life are going to be thrown once more, after 20 years of working in the space, now another 15 or 20 years of being effective in the context where things are going to get much worse before they start recovering. And I will be living into the much worse phase, and that's terrifying sometimes. But it's finding meaning within that, which I think is in lockstep with this idea of hope. I think that is what makes us as an animal extraordinary. Gabriel, let's come to you now. From your perspective as a climate change coordinator, you are young and you are specifically in I guess one could say, a vulnerable sector, a community. How are you seeing people dealing with and talking about this climate crisis? Are people being frank? Are they being honest? Are they in denial? What is your take?
Thank you. I think there's a degree of everything incorporated, because of course, not everything is quite as black and white as we would hope it could be. We could say, cool, this is wrong and this is right, but everything is a gray space, I think, to a degree. And what we're really seeing is that people in my community and communities like mine and communities worse off than my own there is a level of denial to some degree, but only because there's a lot of jargon used around the words that we integrate into our communities. Oftentimes you hear NGOs coming into the community to save the community, when in fact the community's probably got a far more adaptive kind of resource and knowledges than these NGOs that come in, and that rather than come in and save them, it should be a partnership to work together and build up. Because communities are empowered already, they're just not necessarily capacitated in the way that we need them to be. And I think that's something that has become a really stark reality for me to witness. There's a level of there's another stigma surrounding climate change, being that people of color and people in marginalized communities don't care about the environment and don't care about what happens to the climate. And this is kind of a narrative that's continuously pushed by the fact that so many aren't necessarily incorporated or involved in movements and mobilizations. But the reality is that so many people who are suffering firsthand experiences can't afford to pay attention to climate only because they're wondering where their next meal is coming from. They understand exactly where their lights are coming from. But at the end of the day, do you fight the lights, or do you just be happy that you can turn on your lights? You can't necessarily go and march in Parliament towards Parliament, but must work because that's your only paycheck, for example. I've been lucky enough to find a job that is able to capacitate me, not through African Climate Alliance, because my work as of right now is voluntary, but through other sectors, through Project 90 by 2030 as the comms person for the environmental space, where I work and try to disseminate information and bring information back from communities as we work hand in hand with them. But I really realized that there's an understanding. Communities know what climate change is to a degree. We know the top layer global warming word, or the top layer, climate injustice word, but not necessarily in the way that we should. So I think a massive way to bridge that gap is through climate literacy and education, which our school system does not offer in any capacity at all. And so I think a way that we need to realize it is through intersectional activism and reality. So many in our communities are fighting social and economic injustices. And as soon as we draw the connections to the climate injustices, immediately the click happens in the mind where they're able to realize that, hey, I'm suffering this because of this, and it's all interconnected, so to speak. And then underneath that umbrella of the system comes our mental issues and our mental instability, or the need for support mentally. Because I must admit, many people don't necessarily realize that the injustices that they're facing are contributing to their mental health, because many don't even feel like it's mental health. They think, oh, I'm just stressed, even though stress is a mental, like a factor of mental health. They just think, I'm tired, I'm stressed, I'm worried. So I definitely think there's a level of capacitation that needs to happen when it comes to knowledge, but also on the other side of it all, there's a level of unlearning that some demographics need to go through when it comes to the stigma of people in marginalized communities not understanding and not caring.
Thank you. There was some interesting research coming out of a primary healthcare clinic, I think in the Cape Flats a few years ago, and the findings are so intuitive. The findings showed that women who are recent mothers, new mothers, are much more likely to experience postnatal depression if they are returning home with their infants into a home or family where there is very little food in the house, because obviously that just amps up any existing stress. And this kind of applies to, this is the human condition. We are evolved as a species to want a little bit of certainty around our resources. And what climate change threatens to do, whether it's undermine food security, threaten our water, create political instability, it just throws another layer of uncertainty and complexity on top of all of our existing struggles. From the perspective of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, once your basic needs are met, your mental well-being has a good foundation. And climate change, these extreme events that we're talking about, threaten that at every single level. There was a wonderful article circulating recently where someone argued that a basic income grant could be viewed as a mental health intervention. Because
I've got something to say to that, actually.
Yes, please do, and then we'll come to you, Max.
Excellent. So just first of all, regarding the study that you mentioned about mothers who come back and into an unstable kind of food environment, I think what we already see is that, because of social norms and gender roles, social reproduction is something that continues to happen and is continuously underpaid or not paid at all or not acknowledged as a form of work. And so when mothers come or people, rather, should I say, come with their babies and, come into an environment where now they've got to take care of the child, they're also going through their own mental and physical struggles. Now they've got to still take care of the entire family, especially in certain communities. And that's something that continues to run through. And then your point about the basic income grant, I was actually having a conversation about that, is that right now, as we face climate injustice and social injustice, which intersect, as I mentioned, a basic income grant would actually be something that needs to come in unison with other aspects in life, because as of right now, if a basic income grant were implemented into our communities, it would, rather than support and capacitate people, it would be paying off the debt that people owe to the government or to the city, for example, when it comes to tariffs and backlogged payments. It would end up being that capacity. So I think there's a level of debt forgiveness that needs to come forward, as well as people being included into more free basic services, so that when they are incorporated into that space and those free basic services are actually capacitated in a lot more sufficient ways, then only can the basic income grant work. But it doesn't make sense getting a basic income grant if you're just going to be paying off debts and not, in fact, building and strengthening yourself in your community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. Max, from your perspective within the therapeutic community, what is your reading of the level of engagement and capacity that our psychiatrists and psychologists and other practitioners have in terms of responding to the climate emergency, and what do they need in order to get where they need to be?
Yeah, thanks, Leonie. I have to say, there's not a lot. It's a minute proportion of psychologists and psychiatrists that I know who are dealing at all with the whole climate anxiety issue. I think that the whole community in any event feels as though there's not enough psychologists to go around just to deal with the individual issues that people are facing, and there's not enough government support, and certainly not in the Western Cape, where there's so many other issues. So, I mean, my sense of it is that it's seen as a luxury to now start dealing with eco-anxiety. There's just simply not the capacity. But having said that, those few therapists and people in the mental health field who have begun doing things have really connected in a very strong way with the need for these things to happen. And possibly where we need to take it is to make it a more explicit banding together in order to really kind of, brainstorm. I think that always has to be a heart storm too, in some way, what we could do as mental health professionals to expand this far further into the community. At the moment, it's largely just even educating mental health professionals that it's actually okay to allow people to talk about eco-anxiety. It's not a resistance to dealing with their own individual problems. And I mean, very much what you were saying, and I think that, many people have alluded to, is that the climate crisis is an umbrella issue which highlights almost every other social justice issue. And, we're not even really, when we go down to the roots of it, looking at an environmental problem. It is also always a humanitarian problem. And beyond that, to the more than human, that's even yet another layer. So yeah, Leonie, I mean, sadly, there isn't a lot that has been happening. If I read your query. But perhaps with the IPCC report, with the COP having just happened in Glasgow, and the fact that this window of opportunity has now been put forward, people will be emboldened to really just step out of some archaic idea of what our therapeutic role is.
I think there are two important take-home messages from our very recent history as a country and as a city, and one would be the day zero situation in Cape Town. I mean, I remember the conversations that took place within my community where I live in Rondebosch, where there's a high percentage of flat-based, apartment-based living. And we were all having conversations, you know, if the water really gets that bad and we can't flush our toilets anymore, what do we do with our solid waste? And it was quite terrifying. I mean, a lot of people were getting really freaked out about the possible implications, whereas others became complete problem solvers. And that realization brought on an emotional response that I found quite surprising. And then, of course, you know, what we saw during the COVID lockdown, when so many people required emergency food aid, and the stress and anxiety that came around that. And the food thing is just a wonderful, it's often the sort of the diamond point of clarity that shows up greater poverty. And all of the aspects of poverty are things that will be made more difficult because of climate. So we already have an intuitive understanding of what some of the issues are. I would really like, through the course of today, to throw solutions out there so that we come away from this feeling like we have a direction to move in. One of the solutions I think is really interesting. I don't know if any of you have heard of the granny benches in Zimbabwe. A professor of psychiatry or psychology, I forget which, decided to test a model in some of the cities there. And he basically trained up women, mostly grannies, and in the basics of layperson's counseling. And then he identified a couple of parks, had benches and lovely flowing foot traffic. And I can't remember how he signboarded the benches, but basically strangers, people wandering through the park, were invited to sit on one of the benches if they wanted to, and sit down, get into conversation with lay counselors. And apparently the positive sort of mental health outcomes of that piloted project have been so good that he's been referenced all over the world. Again, I reckon that's a relatively low budget way to scale up support without having to put more people through 8 years of training for psychotherapy. If any of you, there are other solutions that we're going to talk about through the course of this morning. If any of the audience members have solutions, please feel free to share that. Sarah, let's come back to you. From the perspective of the City of Cape Town, what do you think the city can do, or what is it planning to do in order to move towards a community-based support model, similar to the one that I've just outlined?
So Leonie, I can't speak for the City of Cape Town. I work for Western Cape Government, but just my perspective is that, yeah, so the Western Cape Government does have a role to play in terms of psychology and mental health support through the various hospitals. Those are oversubscribed, like we've been discussing. Like you mentioned that earlier, that one statistic, which is you know, it's a very real challenge that we have in our society. And I would say that through our climate change response strategy, which is still in creation mode, essentially, that we need to actually bring this in and say, okay, well, are there solutions? Are there ways that we can bring in these more intersectional responses like Gabriel was talking to? So it doesn't have to be a separate standalone intervention, but how do we weave it into what is existing in our communities, and how do we provide support to the kinds of leaders that we already have in our communities? You know, communities have all got their own existing structures and ways of holding each other together. I would say that, we can reflect on the drought experience and the pandemic and see where have been the shining lights, and how do we interconnect climate change into those shining lights, those solutions that already are in place. I know that during the drought, for example, a lot of the religious groups and leaders came to the fore, and they kind of led their communities. So can we bring climate change kind of support into those spaces and other types of leadership spaces and community spaces? I think it's something that we really need to look more at, and it's not something that's just going to come from government, but needs to be collaboratively kind of co-created. So I think that that's an important area to look at. I also think that there's a way to maybe be looking at our open spaces or our schools, our various facilities that we have available, and say, well, how can we use these spaces as well to make them open for either groups to share with each other. There needs to be a lot more dialogue around that, and really helping grassroots bottom-up spaces to emerge, not necessarily top-down government kind of created ones, but really from the bottom up, because that is where the need is. And I think that's also, it can be part of a hopeful and positive response if we can actually work on the emotional side, the mental health side of climate change. It can also create positive kind of responses in terms of solutions and working together. So that's just a few ideas coming out there.
Great, thank you, Sarah. This also just brings to mind some interesting conversations that have been happening around, from a city scale level. The importance of preserving green belts in cities. So green belts, whether it's a patch of indigenous bush or wetland, or even a grassy football field that hasn't been paved over, all of these spaces provide natural airbags that will help a city and a community buffer against an extreme event like a heat wave or a terrible fire or whatever. But at the same time, there's also a huge amount of research to show the mental health benefits, the general well-being benefits of having exposure to nature, including within cities. I think there's a lovely term for it, nature bathing. But there's a lot of research that mental well-being and even our physical recovery from illness or surgery, for instance, is boosted and enhanced by having exposure to nature spaces. And I think if one were to overlap those two issues and think about how we manage Cape Town as a city, it makes us realize that any little untransformed piece of land that has a natural vegetation on it becomes a precious, precious gem of a space that will help us as a city cope, both with the extreme events that are coming as well as the mental health fallout, which makes it, more important for us as a city to plan to keep those places preserved and to lobby really hard against efforts to pave over every little bit of greenery. I think that's kind of a critical direction that we as citizens in the city need to do. Gabriel, let's come back to you. What do you think the youth need in terms of support? What practically do the youth need?
So I'd first like to talk to a few things that were said prior before I jump into it. First, the idea of the granny bench or the friendship bench, I'll definitely check that out because I do like the idea of that. But to that point comes in making sure that the person holding the space for other people are themselves capacitated with support. Otherwise, it just becomes this continuation of dumping and becomes a dumping ground. And then the idea of it being women who sit on the bench becoming once again a dumping ground for other people's emotional baggage is quite a troublesome thought. So I do hope that there are support structures for the women who are being capacitated to hold those spaces. Next is just the point of the systems, that are being, put forward, I think, and I'm looking forward to getting other ideas, especially from the audience in the chat, is just, what systems can be put forward and what plans can be put forward. And I'll also mention a few of my own after I speak now, which just is doing a big thing for me, because those support structures won't be used unless the stigma is broken, first of all. I recall distinctly feeling as though I wanted to kill myself in high school and attempting after, that I didn't want to go into my guidance counselor's office, because the second I stepped in there, not only was I going to be made fun of by the students, but I knew for a fact that she was going to speak to teachers about it. And then, there was also a fear that my parents would find out. And so I don't understand why I felt that way. But now looking back, I'm slowly realizing it's because there's this idea that you are crazy. And the wording that we use in our communities, just mal, go play outside, just that idea alone has been, we've been suppressed. And I mentioned this in a conversation with Marcella a while ago, growing up, we learned the support number for Childline. We can sing it because we remember the advert about the lion, the griffin, and the owl that came together and gave the number out. But what number do we call when we are not a child anymore for support? Do we know what the toll-free numbers are? Are those toll-free numbers and the individuals on the other side capacitated to answer the phone when we need them the most? And then also coming into the point of, and this factors into what youth need, we need support where we feel welcomed. I won't want to go and sit in a room where, and I'm okay with anyone speaking to me, but I don't want to sit in a room where, maybe someone who's got a bit of racist tendencies are going to, spout at me about, this and that. We've seen that in the medical field too often, especially with Black women, where, they are underdiagnosed or not diagnosed correctly with issues and different factors that affect them because the mental or the health system was not designed with them in mind. And I think that's something that's coming forward again, as well as LGBTQIA plus people. Do I feel comfortable? I remember distinctly after, I think it was 2017, in June, I went to go and see the counselor for the first time ever. And for a very long time after that, I never spoke to someone again. I sat there, and I do practice religion, but not to a massive extent. And I distinctly remember sitting there. She asked me, "Are you Christian?" I said, "Yes." And she immediately started spouting Christian support kind of things. And I was like, "No, but I'm also queer, and I'm also just very much anti-establishment. And also I'm going on a journey myself." But she immediately took that as an invitation to bring in her own aspect. And so I think what young people need is, first of all, for our parents and our grandparents and our guardians to be, destigmatized in the space. We need, practical, in community-based kind of, and I don't know how we'll do it, but I definitely think if you work with community leaders and faith-based leaders, because that's how you get into communities, because you won't get into a community if the faith-based leader or the community leaders don't deem you worthy, so to speak. The gatekeepers of the community's respect and dignity. And I'm grateful for them because too often are we abused in the communities. But I definitely want to mention that is something that we need, is we need capacity within our communities, but also outside of our communities. You mentioned, Leonie, the green strips and the greenery aspect. In my community, the only greenery that we have is, sometimes a flea that has some informal housing on it. And you can't expect someone who lives in the informal housing to feel at home and feel at peace because of the greenery that's sitting there, because it's still the fact that they are in an informal housing system. We live in an area where we play the game at night. Is it a car backfiring or is it gunshots? And that is a reality. Why is it that I have to drive or take a taxi to Rondebosch Common, to feel peace? Why do I have to go to Newlands Forest to walk? And this is all about the spatial apartheid that continues. And so when we introduce, and as I wrap up this section and pass to someone else, when we introduce these ideas of green spaces and safe spaces for community members, I recall definitely the way that I was after high school through Project 90 by 2030's hiking and leadership program, introduced to this idea that, wow, I'm out of my community, I'm able to breathe in this space. There's just something about being away from your home environment into nature that makes you feel liberated. But now when we introduce these things with the City of Cape Town and the Western Cape government, how do we ensure that it's not only a space for, and I hate to say it, but privileged and white people? How do we ensure that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are once again capacitated in these spaces? And it's not once again gentrified spaces that are then as soon as a Black or brown person comes in, the WhatsApp groups get, Black man in car around corner. It's like, no, he's just trying to enjoy the environment. And we see that too often. So I definitely think as young people, we need, first of all, our communities to be capacitated to understand what mental health really is and that we all have a mental health. And then two, for us to realize that, we need, us being anyone in this room and outside this room, to realize that young people need safe spaces that are inclusive and that don't judge.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we're down to our last half an hour. So if you do have any questions, please send them through. So Gabriel, you've reminded me of two things. One is this wonderful case study of the wetland in Makaza in Kailita that was restored. So this was an incredible initiative where a bunch of women in the neighborhood got together with the Environmental Monitoring Group, a civil society organization, and the City of Cape Town. And together they cleaned up this wetland. They got rid of a lot of invasive plants. They got rid of a lot of dumped garbage and planted beautiful fynbos along the edges and put lovely lawns in place and basically allowed the wetland to start functioning again. And I remember interviewing a woman around her experience of it, and she said it was like having our own Kirstenbosch right here in our backyard. And this isn't just a feel-good story. I think this is a story that shows how absolutely critical it is to bring these green spaces into every community. It shouldn't just be something that is accessible to the privileged. The other thing that I'm struck by is, that taking care of one's mental health is very much like good oral hygiene. If you want to take care of your teeth, you want to brush your teeth every day, floss regularly, maybe once a year you go to your dentist, and every now and then you might have to have something serious like a root canal or something. But, taking care of our mental well-being is quite similar, as cheesy as it might sound, but exercising regularly if one can, meditating, mindfulness meditation, these are all sort of daily practices that can help keep one on an even keel. And then every now and then you might need to go for counseling of some sort. And every now and then you might have an acute a fever of mental discomfort, in which case, you go to a hospital and you get hospitalized, or you have a ketamine infusion or something, which is like your root canal. But if we can train and teach our children and our youngsters these daily and regular practices that can just help slowly, keep the airplane flying through the turbulence without too much motion. I think that's, these are tools which humans have been using for hundreds and even thousands of years. If you look at certain Buddhist practices, are about managing one's mental state. Max, let's come to you again. Where do you think, how do we take the skills that, for instance, you have working with adults, how do you think they need to be translated to teenagers and youngsters? Is it pretty much the same thing, or does it have to be adapted?
Leonie, if I can just change the direction a little bit of that question. I'm going to go back to one of the comments there from Andrew Beren about, do we not need to be really looking into the deeper, very long-seated anxiety that we have from being disconnected from nature, and to look at our kind of anthropocentric ways of being in the world. And one of the first contributions of eco-psychology was to look at some of the terms that we use, usually for humans in psychology, but which we can apply to our very dysfunctional, our bad attachment, our poor attachment to Mother Earth. And one of those is, autistic, is that people who are severely on the autistic spectrum have a difficulty in seeing or hearing or responding to a mother. And, the early eco-psychologists were saying this is how we are really as a species. The other thing that they looked at was, using the addiction model, is that despite the fact that we know we're harming, our relationship with natural systems, there's something compulsive about the way we continue to engage with the natural systems that sustain us. And then there's, of course, dissociation, which is where we just cannot engage with uncomfortable truths. So we numb out and become paralyzed. So I think in terms of youth and adults, my own sense is I keep coming back to what happened in 94 or pre-94, those of us who were old enough. There was a huge campaign to spread and disseminate information about democracy and about how to vote, because there was millions of people going to vote for the first time. And a lot of thought went into how do we spread this message quickly? And modules, training modules were put together with a lot of people coming in as sort of as specialists in communities and for all sorts of things. And training modules were put forward. And once a cohort of trainers had been trained, then a second layer was train the trainers. And they went out, and then it became much more something what Gabriel was discussing is peer-to-peer. So it's this sort of, it was trickle down, but the initial information came from the bottom up is how are we going to approach this question in this community or that community. And the message went out very, very quickly. And again, I agree with Gabriel. I remember my beat was the Rema churches. I don't know why, but they were incredibly influential in allowing that message. Well, obviously they were pro voting for the first time and democracy. But maybe we need to bring together people who have really contributed hugely in all communities, across all age groups, class, gender, race, everything, and put together some kind of training that will take into account everything that informs what we need to be doing in the next decade. And I don't even think it's a decade. And then working out the best ways of getting this quickly to spread as capillaries into every single community. And in that process, to really access the voice of the youth and have them actually, there are things that the youth can do that I certainly don't know. The challenges are so much worse for them than they were for me growing up, but they also have tools which we never had, like the internet, like social media platforms, TikTok. Not everybody has that access, but, to be using those platforms as well, and using the skills and talents that youth have in abundance that older people don't have. And in that process, I suppose, calling on people who have traditionally kept Indigenous knowledge systems going so that we can learn more about how, we had 50,000 generations of being hunter-gatherers. We had a connection with nature. We didn't see ourselves as superior. We saw ourselves as intimately part of nature and connected to those systems. And we need to have those voices brought back into however we disseminate this information. But I suppose my point is it was done once and it can be done again. Thank you.
Max, thank you for commenting or responding to that issue of our disconnection. It reminds me of the Jeremy Lent book, The Patterning Instinct. And what I found so incredibly hopeful and hope-inspiring about that book was, as you said, Max, that for 50, however many generations, we've been hunter-gatherers much longer than we've been industrialized, urbanized, disconnected humans. And that we have the echoes of that need for connection deeply, deeply embedded in our brain and our nervous system. And we can restructure our society if we are quick and agile and responsive and deliberate about it. So there are many ways that even in this highly transformed world, we can support connection with each other and with nature. And I'm also reminded of George Monbiot's wonderful writings around the mental health consequences of being this highly capitalist, urbanized human, where we are isolated from one another, even though we're living in these congested cities. If we can just find ways to make eye contact, to see one another again and be with one another. Sarah, please step in.
Thanks, Leonie. I just wanted to add to what Max was saying. I think that that's, yeah, really profound, just, you know, learning from previous experiences that we've had in South Africa and thinking about what we can do practically moving forward. And I think there are models that we can kind of build on and bring together. I facilitate groups for something called the Good Grief Network, and it's a peer-to-peer kind of movement. Essentially, they want this to ripple out and others to be trained and, you know, others to give the groups. And so there are these groups, and there's also the work that we connect. There's these different models that we could adapt and connect with the South African culture and see how to actually do that in our context that makes meaning and sense and talks to a lot of what Gabriel was talking about. And there's a lot of practices that we can weave into this work of sort of shifting consciousness, rebuilding our relationship with Earth, with each other. And I know this is probably sounding very like wishful thinking, but I believe that we can do it if the right people get together and actually see that it's a priority in our climate change response. So it's really fundamental that our society is able to adapt to climate change as human beings. We've got so much work going on around all the technological infrastructure kind of responses and what we do, but so little around how we as humans psychologically adapt to what's going on. So I think it's a real priority in South Africa and the Western Cape that we figure something out and bring a body of people together to actually crack it and move something forward.
Yes, I have some lovely thoughts on that, which I'm going to come back to later. I don't want to take up too much floor space now because we are running out of time. But Gabriel, here's a question for you from one of our panelists. What would you say are some of the demands that you would suggest of government in order to meet its responsibilities with regards to young people in this context? What would be the first steps? How would you envision someone's dog is barking in the background? What would you say are the first steps? What do you envision in a youth government collaboration to support the youth?
So first of all, I'd like to just mention that there's a stigma around, I keep using the word stigma, but I genuinely, there is a stigma that young people don't want anything to do with government. And I want to just put on the record there, for the most part, young people actually believe that we have to work to a degree with government, and we can't just, you know, have this independent kind of movement. It's cross-cutting through civil society, and it can't just be working with communities only, because we do need our government to make the change. Because I believe that while a lot of change can happen on the ground, at the end of the day, it's our decision makers that make the decisions. And so I definitely think that a massive thing that I've noticed, especially in regards to climate change and the impacts that we have with it, is that there's a continued blissful ignorance that is perpetuated in our government as it regards to the impacts of mental health from climate change. You know, and I think to themselves, they don't understand it entirely. And this is not a shot at anyone, it's just a level of what I've noticed. And maybe it's because I've noticed with specific people in government, not necessarily any parties, but there is this you know, idea that, you know, climate change to a degree isn't real. And so our decision makers, our ministers, aren't necessarily prioritizing the, you know, the ways that in which, you know, if we don't combat climate change, we don't, in essence, combat the effects that climate change has on people's mental health. If you look at the study that was dumped in the chat a bit earlier by Dr. Garrett Bonwell, you'll actually get quite an amazing look into the way that climate change impacts in quite a shocking way, in fact. And then ways in which we can move forward. I think something that came out of last year's pandemic, or still continuing pandemic, but last year's massive lockdown, was some amazing learnings of solidarity and community support, but also this initiative of a just recovery, you know, and that was specifically towards the pandemic, wanting us to put people over profit, wanting us to ensure that no one is left behind after the fact or after we come out of this pandemic. But I think we need a just recovery, so to speak, when it comes to climate change and the impacts that mental health have on young people. We need government to sit down with us from the beginning and have a conversation. Young people are willing to have these conversations, are willing to have these engagements from the beginning. It's just we're never called upon until the 11th hour. We saw that with our NDCs when government called upon us a week or two before they were finalizing things. And I just genuinely want to mention that inclusion is, or true inclusion is when people are integrated from the beginning, from the brainstorming section of it all. And what I'm hearing from Sarah and a few others on the panel today is that there's a want for government to learn how to build it up. I think it was mentioned, let me just see my notes quickly, that we need to welcome the professionals on the panel and in the room today for this. I think you mentioned in the very beginning in your opening statement, Sarah, was for that initiative or that paper that was coming out or something or other. But I genuinely urge you to also, and I think you will, engage with communities in those first-hand experiences in marginalized communities, and I'm more than happy to kind of open that door and kind of show you where you can begin, even if I'm sure you probably know where to begin. But I definitely implore you and other officials in government to realize that the only way we come up with solutions that people want is when we have solutions that incorporate people's wants from them and not from what we think they want, or not from a paper or an article that a journalist wrote, because it becomes a game of broken telephone where we go through the different sources, we go through NGOs, we go through NPOs, we go through media, which is amazing because that means it's publicized at least. But we need to go to the source, you know, where is it most affecting us? And this is not just in marginalized communities, this is everywhere. How do we ensure that all are addressed? And so what I say to young people, or what I say is that we need to have a dialogue where young people and government are interacting from the beginning so we can come up with ways forward. Otherwise, I think it's just all thoughts and prayers otherwise.
Yeah, thoughts and prayers don't necessarily help when you're really hungry. So I'm just thinking quickly, one of the take-home messages from the COVID pandemic, which was pulled together really beautifully in a document called the Food Dialogues Report, which I'll post the link a little bit later, but it showed the importance of local economic development in order to make individual families more resilient in the context of an extreme event, such as, you know, losing a job and not being able to put food on the table, and how that links to climate and mental health. If in India, there was a period of time where small-scale farmers were highly economically pressured, unable to stay in the farming industry, and very, very high suicide rates as a result. There was a similar story that appeared in the South African press at the height of the very bad drought. I think it was in about 2018, where there was apparently a number of suicides amongst farmers. And again, this was an indication of the mental health fallout of having to deal with the stress, the economic stress that comes with a drought and losing your livelihood. So for anyone in any context where the future and the resilient or the resources are threatened because of an extreme event, it shows that putting economic development in that context at a local scale is what is going to make that individual and that community less likely to to fall. You know, death by depression, death by anxiety. It's a hell of a thing for someone to be so despondent and despairing that they will overcome that inherent need to stay alive. Local economic development as another mental health intervention. All right, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists now to just wrap up your concluding thoughts in a sentence or two. Starting with Sarah, sorry.
Thanks, Leonie. I have a lot of thoughts, and I really just want to say I really appreciate the inputs today from Max and Gabriel. That they're really heartfelt and really appreciated. Yeah, there's a lot of work to do is one of my big take-home messages. But I think that there's also a lot of goodwill and ideas, and we need to really kind of create a better network of individuals to actually work together collaboratively in this space. I think that is starting to emerge, but I think we need to kind of move faster is my take-home message. Yeah.
Gabriel.
First, to realize that we can come out of conversations with actions and not just hopes. We need to look at things intersectionally and across generations. Solutions aren't made overnight, but we can start them and hope that we can come out stronger. Thank you.
Max, what would you like to finish?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, there is just so much to be said on, you know, and which we haven't even got to, but I also feel really grateful for having the input of the three of you into this conversation. I do feel that what gets us out of anxiety is, first of all, speaking and sharing, you know, our pain, our gratitude for the earth that we live on. You know, we need to do that we need a space in which to do that and to be witnessed. And I think that, you know, psychology can add a lot in terms of how do you create those strong containers for people to look at really uncomfortable truths and to deal with very, very strong emotions. And it would be wonderful if we could work with government and with communities and really put together some kind of information and action modules that could be then taken down in that peer-to-peer way and training the trainers deep into all of the communities. And then I just wanted to end with a quote by an American environmentalist activist, Mary Eggelar. And her thing is, you know, what we need as people who are kind of thinking about this and leading in the field is not to get overwhelmed by the complexity of the issues, but to fall in love with the creativity of the solutions. And that's a hard place to hold, but it's one that I do, you know, say as a mantra for myself, is looking at the creativity of the solutions.
Thank you very much. This has been an outstanding morning. Thank you, everyone. I do want to just flag the fact that Max has done a lot of work in the background, pulling together kind of a curriculum for the process-based work that needs to happen around helping people to manage this emotional overwhelm that comes with what we're facing. And, you know, this isn't a small little pollution problem that, you know, we're going to solve in the next year or two and then it's done and dusted, we can move on. We are going to be grappling with this for the rest of our lives. And we have to find ways to pace ourselves within that. Keep ourselves healthy so that we can help others healthy alongside us. So thank you everyone for your participation today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. Also, thank you to the partners who pulled this together. And Marcelo, you did a fantastic job coordinating and putting the speakers together and the topics. Thank you for that. Thank you to the City of Cape Town as well for its support. these the Futurecasting series is ongoing, and in the new year, a whole new series of topics will come up. Marcella's going to pop a link in the chat window, so bookmark that for early next year and keep an eye on it, and join the team again in the new year. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic weekend.